Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to this month's March online lecture. I think it's the 21st since this series began in April 2020. I'm Richard Norman. I'm the Development Director and one of the Fellows of the College. It's such a pleasure to have another great cross-section of students, fellows, staff, friends, and of course alumni of the College. I think we can see some familiar faces and names in the attendee list, and some people for the first time too, so welcome to you all. My job today is to introduce this month's lecturer, Nick Dickinson, who's with me on the screen. Nick is the Bingham Early Career Fellow in Constitutional Studies, which means that he's quite a recent hire to the college on Balliol's Early Career Fellowships programme, where we offer young academics 3 or 4 year fixed term fellowships at the college. It's a great injection of youth for the Balliol Fellowship, and most importantly, fantastic for Balliol students who get to be taught by some of the really brightest emerging talents in their field. And I can't let this moment go past without saying that I can see several donors to the ECF scheme on this call, and thanks to you all. But I particularly wanted to acknowledge, before we began, the donor to Nick's fellowship, the Bingham Early Career Fellowship, who I think is watching from France, at least I hope he is. In naming this particular fellowship, which is in Constitutional Studies, Peter, who's our benefactor, he chose to honour Lord Bingham of Cornhill, the famous jurist, former senior law lord, who of course was an alumnus and honorary fellow and latterly a visitor of the college. So no pressure, Nick. Nick joined Balliol straight from his doctoral studies at Exeter University, and before that he read history and politics at Corpus Christi in Oxford. At the moment, he teaches politics to Balliol's current students, and we're going to hear a really classic topic of politics teaching and research today on legislative pay. Nick will talk for about half an hour, and there'll be a chance after that for us to talk about your questions. You can submit questions as you go along by looking at the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can vote for the questions you like. So the earlier your question gets in, the more likely it is that you'll have the most upvoted question by the end. So don't delay on that. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Nick, who's going to talk to us for about half an hour on the topic From Representation to Meritocracy, Understanding Professionalisation of Parliamentary Pay Debates from 2011 to 2021. Nick, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you for everyone joining today. I was just reflecting to Richard before we began that it's been a strange 2 years for academics, as for everyone, and we've really not been able to sort of talk to our colleagues and to others about research maybe as much as we'd like. And I also know from organising events for the college just how fantastic a resource our alumni and our sort of broader network are, and the sort of depth of experience that is sort of brought to these seminars and lectures for that reason. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my research with you all today. So I'm just going to share my screen so that I can show you a few slides as we go. What I'm going to be talking about today is some research which emerged out of my doctorate, but which I've really kind of been working on more or less over the last year. So what I study is the amount that politicians get paid. But the reason why I study that is not so much because of the inherent interest in the amount, but because of what it tells us about some of the broader and deeper issues in British politics and in politics around the world. And what I think it's linked to most particularly is this notion of the political class, and particularly the professionalisation of the political class. And I think this is significant because observers of modern politics often point to professional politicians as a source of distrust with political elites in advanced democracies. And that attitude is rooted, at least in part, in a long-standing reticence about the creation of a salaried political class. This is all the more significant because over the course of the 20th century, legislative politics in particular has transitioned from a part-time activity conducted primarily by those with independent incomes to a full-time profession conducted by career politicians. So consequently, while in the past, legislators were often financially supported by aristocratic interests or funds from organised labour, Modern legislative bodies compensate their members directly with salaries, expenses, and pensions akin to those of other professions. However, very few studies have assessed systematically how politicians themselves have negotiated this transition and presented it to often skeptical publics. Literature on the political class has mainly focused on documenting the changing social, educational, occupational profile of the political elite, which I'll talk about in a minute. And other studies have tackled the critical public views of 21st century politicians, analysing the so-called moral panics which have occurred as a result of these professionalising trends. So the study I've conducted and will be presenting today tried to sort of bridge the gap between these two ways of studying the political class by looking specifically at political rhetoric focused on the development of the political class as used by politicians themselves. And the way I approached this was to do so by conducting an analysis of 23 major debates on legislators' salaries in the British Parliament, which took place between 1911, when pay for MPs was first instituted, and 2011, when the process was handed off to the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, which now makes the decisions for MPs. And the reason why I did this was because these debates encapsulate some really important sort of testimony that MPs themselves gave, not just about justifying their level of pay, but also about their careers, about their motivations for entering politics, and about their conception of what the role of an MP is. So to start with then, let's think a little bit more about this issue of what we mean by professionalisation of the political class. So when we think about what politicians do, we often think about political careers as something which, or at least in the past, we thought often about political careers as something which sort of did not last maybe particularly long. They were conducted by people who primarily had either other occupations or had come up through structures like the trade union movement. But increasingly what we saw across the 20th century was political careers which started earlier and lasted longer, creating career politicians who spent most of their lives in politics. We also saw an intensification of the occupation itself, from something which went to part-time to full-time, and now indeed an occupation which consumes almost the entire lives of politicians. The hours that MPs work are now very, very long, leaving them very little time to do anything else. Perhaps more controversial, though, and connected to this, we've also seen changing social backgrounds of MPs, in particular higher levels of education and fewer working class MPs, or MPs with working class backgrounds over time. So to show you some of the trends in this area, so this is information published by the House of Commons Library, we can see that at the end of the 1970s, something roughly around 60% of MPs on average had graduated from a university, slightly higher for the Conservatives, slightly lower for Labour. And that over time this has risen now to the point where it's something well over 80% of MPs now have some sort of university background. Well, simultaneously seen, if we look at MPs pre-political organisations, which is the graph on the right, a sort of rise in miscellaneous organisations. So this is often third sector organisations, professions outside of the traditional set of professions which fed into politics, such as law and journalism, and a simultaneous decline in the number of manual workers, or manual working backgrounds. So a decline in the number of working class MPs and a rise in the number of MPs who have the kind of education and background that we would associate with other professions. An understudied aspect of this, however, but an important one, as I think I've said, is the role of payment for political work. So the importance of official salaries to sustain a political class has actually long been recognised by political theorists. So as Max Weber argued in his classic essay, Politics as a Vocation, quote, "There are two ways of making politics one's vocation. Either one lives for politics or one lives off politics. And only one who strives to make a permanent source of income lives off politics as a vocation." More significantly, though, Weber argued that this was a crucial aspect of democratization, that only if it was possible to live off politics could political leadership be widened to a group broader than some sort of traditional oligarchy. This we can think of as the first and most essential justification for political pay. So as Weber goes on in Politics as a Vocation, politics can be conducted either on an honorary basis, which means by so-called independent, that is wealthy people, above all those with unearned income, or access to political leadership can be given to people without private means, in which case it has to be remunerated. Now, this is a pretty good justification for politics. It's for payment of politics. It's one that's still largely widely accepted today, although, as we'll talk about in a minute, one which initially had to be fought for quite hard. However, this justification, as you'll probably already notice, only goes so far. We can only justify a sort of certain level of pay with this. And it runs very quickly into these populist attitudes, which tend to suggest that pay for politicians, once it gets too high, is in some sense fundamentally anti-democratic. And this sentiment has been expressed in various forms, but I think the most memorable one was in the BBC TV show The Thick of It, where in one episode Malcolm Tucker says in response to the minister having got a chair, which is particularly nice, that people don't like their politicians to be comfortable. They don't like you having expenses, they don't like you being paid, they'd rather you lived in a, expletive deleted, cave. So there's some need then, when we think about the professionalization of pay, to move from a representational justification through these objections to rising pay by using some sort of new rhetorical strategy or new justification. And I think the clearest candidate for such a justification that justifies higher pay for politicians is a justification which justifies higher pay in many other professions, and that is the meritocratic justification. So meritocracy is an idea that we're now much familiar with, but as Michael Young reminded us, or as Michael Young wrote in the 1950s, it was an idea that itself we really have to associate with the kind of later 20th century, with the sort of idea of social mobility. But although in that sense, meritocracy is a sort of egalitarian concept in a sense, it also, as Michael Young wrote in this classic book, is a system in which, quote, the eminent know that their success is a just reward for their own capacity and their own efforts. And he goes on to say that also those who then aren't rewarded know that although they are not receiving high rewards from society, the system is overall just, right? That those who are deserving are being rewarded. And so meritocracy acts in a sense, as one study puts it, as a system justifying ideology for high pay and inequality. It's also strongly linked, and again, this links back to the changing backgrounds of MPs, to an educational version of the class structure conceived around the middle class professional ideal. So my expectation then going into this was that in order to justify increases in their pay, politicians over time, reacting to the differing social justifications around pay, would start to lean less on the traditional representational justification, which we can see, as Weber puts it, quite linked to notions of democratization, to one more based on meritocracy, based on the idea that politicians should be those who are the most qualified for the job, and that we need to raise their pay in order to attract such people to politics. I also expected coming into this as well that what would come along with this was a rhetoric of professionalism, by which I mean that MPs would start to compare themselves more to the other professions, to benchmark themselves in a sense against highly educated professional groups, rather than emphasizing, as would be more traditional, the uniqueness of their role. So as I mentioned, the way I explored this was by leveraging these debates on pay between 1911 and 2011. And really these, as I say, are kind of a unique resource generated by the need for politicians to vote on their own pay. And they needed to do so largely because, unlike almost every other area of life, and even every other area of the public sector, There was no one above Parliament. We live in a system of parliamentary sovereignty, and thus, in a sense, Parliament is always in control of its own pay. But at least historically, it was also directly in control of its own pay, voting either directly on amounts or on the mechanism used to determine the pay of parliamentarians. So this is both different from the market and different from the public sector as a whole, whose pay, of course, the frameworks are themselves determined by Parliament. So it really creates a kind of unique problem for MPs, and one which creates, as I said, these regular occasions on which they have to stand up and justify their pay on the basis of what their role is and what sort of person should be an MP. That said, it's not only MPs who shaped this over time, and as I'll talk about, what was important in this process was some of the infrastructure that began to be built up around the pay setting process, from the first independent commission, which looked into these issues in 1964, through to the creation of a system under the top salaries review body, what would later become the senior salaries review body, and then later the Baker Review in 2008 into MPs' pay, and since 2009 and 2011, IPSA's reviews of MPs' pay. So I did this using a method called thematic content analysis, which in its simplest terms looks through texts to try and find consistent themes and arguments in order that we can kind of understand how the structures of the arguments that were used changed over time, as well as what the balance of different arguments being deployed by MPs were. I did this by taking a pre-existing typology of different arguments around the pay of people high up in the public sector, of which MPs, as I said, can kind of be seen as a special case. And this laid out 7 different broad categories and 21 different individual arguments. And you can see these are relatively kind of familiar concepts. So one argument is that when we're using taxpayers' money to pay people, then that should always lead to a system in which we minimize pay. Another argument, for example, which I didn't focus on but was quite prominent, is what you see there as the example argument, a common argument that was made, especially around MPs' pay, that in the context of, say, holding down public expenditure or holding down inflation, public officials like MPs should be expected to take a lead, and therefore their pay should be low. In terms of the kind of interesting philosophical themes, though, that, as I said, I explored in this piece, representation and meritocracy, the important arguments that I took from this were the one you can see there around motivation selection, the idea that MPs should be motivated to go into politics by an inherent desire to do public service, and therefore they should sacrifice the ability to earn higher salaries elsewhere. And simultaneously, the argument that MPs should in a sense live like the common people. You can see an argument there called better democracy, which argues along that representational justification that public officials should be paid something in order that anyone can become an MP, but that ultimately it should only be set at a level which just about allows that to happen and no more. However, at the same time, we also have arguments within this grid, such as optimal performance. And this really is the kind of meritocratic justification, particularly this idea that we want to, as is said on there, recruit the most qualified individuals to become politicians. And therefore, pay should be set high enough to attract people to politics who might otherwise be able to earn high salaries in the rest of the economy. So as I said, it's not so much about the exact level of pay which is justified with these arguments. It's more about what people feel is an appropriate argument to make with regards to a democratic representative and how this shifts over time, because this tells us something about the conception of the role, rather than just something interesting about the level of pay that they end up with. So what did we find when we do this? So let's look at the numbers first, and then in a second I'll sort of get into some of the detail of sort of what the qualitative evidence from these debates tells us about this. So here we can see that better democracy argument in the sort of the grey bar. This was the one I mentioned, which best represents that representational justification, the idea that MPs should be paid enough that anyone can become an MP, but no more. And as you can see in the early debates, starting in 1911 on the left-hand side and running up to 1971, we can see that the predominant that argument sort of predominated in debates, representing something around sort of 20 to 25% of arguments made on average in debates on MPs' pay. Conversely, the striped bar, which you can see, recruiting the most qualified individuals, was a relatively rarely used argument early on, representing something like 5 to 10% of all arguments, going up slightly in the 1950s. I'll talk about why that's interesting in a minute, before kind of declining again. However, what you can see from really the late 1970s is that this flips around entirely, and it becomes recruiting the most qualified individuals, that meritocratic argument, which is made more often. Between sort of 10 to 15% of all arguments become related to recruiting the most qualified individuals. Whereas the argument about better democracy declines from its share of sort of 15 to 25% through to, on average, a share of around 5%. So there's a really clear shift in the balance of these two arguments over time, with the crossover point sometime around the mid to late 1970s. So what do these arguments look like in practice? Because I've sort of described this at a bit of an abstract level, but I think, as I say, the detail of this is some of the most interesting things about these debates. So the representational justification can be seen most clearly in probably the most famous and widely quoted speech on MPs' pay, which was this 1911 speech by Lloyd George, who was, of course, Chancellor at the time, and he's introducing this legislation, which is to say that the £400 a year, which is what the payment was when it was initially introduced, was not a remuneration, not a recompense, and not even a salary. It is just an allowance, and the minimum allowance to enable men to come here who would render incalculable service to the state otherwise. So this emphasis on a minimum allowance and widening representation. And this really is the sort of the kind of qualitative anchor that I kind of looked for representational justifications. However, even before we see this sort of spike in rhetoric at the beginning, we start to, even as early as the middle of the 20th century, see arguments which start to nod in the direction of meritocracy, but also do so in a way which reflect these themes that I talked about earlier of the changing class background of MPs. This, from like the 1946 debate, which actually almost doubled MPs' pay, was particularly kind of interesting in this respect. So this is a quote from an MP in that 1946 debate. It's a guy called Will Nally, who was a Labour MP, former journalist, who pointed out that the meaning of middle class was shifting in the 1940s. So what he says that among backbenchers supporting the government, and this is supporting the government on the Labour side, are a large group of what can be called middle class people, but with this important difference, that these are in fact the first generation with working class parents, but with secondary and, again, crucially, university education. The result is that so far as background, savings, parenthood, and amount of capital, they are not middle class at all. So what we see is the emergence of this kind of modern middle class professional ideal, where being middle class is not so much about the possession of wealth, but about the possession of education, which allows you to enter professional occupations, and that Parliament, as with the rest of the economy and the rest of society, is being dragged in this direction. And so debates about pay and raising pay are being considered in that context. This, though, over time, as I showed with those numbers, begins to become a more and more dominant argument. And so by the 1980s, MPs themselves, interestingly, are beginning to recognize that this is the shift that's occurred, including some explicitly linking to the concept of meritocracy. So in a 1983 debate on pay, a Conservative MP said this: "When I was elected in 1945, I was an island in a wave of socialism," and says in Latin, "rare swimmers in a vast vortex. We spoke Latin in those days, but the world has changed since 1945, as have the principles for which we fought then. There are new principles, essentially those of meritocracy. Rightly or wrongly, the people believe in that, and goes on to say that this should also be the principle on which MPs' pay should therefore be based. So if we see that clear shift then from representation to meritocracy, do we also see the same shift from a rhetoric emphasizing the uniqueness of the MP's role, that MPs should be publicly motivated, to a rhetoric which compares MP's role to other professions? Well, again, looking at the numbers, I think we can see the same thing. So the dark grey bar represents that argument for motivation selection. The argument that I mentioned before, that MPs should be motivated to go into politics, such that pay should be low in order to assure that their inherent motivation for public service is the reason why they become MPs. Conversely, fairness and broad comparability there is the argument that I use to code this idea that MPs compare themselves to other professions. So this can be referenced often to civil servants, but also doctors, lawyers, sort of other kind of classic professional groups. And again, we can see at the very beginning, this is a very rare argument. And in fact, I coded the opposite of these arguments. And in those early debates, most people actually push back quite hard against this idea that MPs should be compared to any other profession. Conversely, motivation selection, this idea that of the inherent value of public service is quite prominent. And again, we see the sort of flip point is again in the 1970s, where suddenly these arguments around fairness and broad comparability to other professions begin to predominate and eclipse these arguments for the inherent motivation of public service. So again, what does this look like? Well, this again is sort of from that first debate in 1911, which kind of shows you what we mean by motivation selection and the kind of language that MPs used around this. So here one MP says, I believe that on the whole, this system of gratuitous public service has worked well. It has produced men of character, ability, knowledge, and experience, and it's a dangerous thing to alter it. And that by altering it, the country would not likely to be better, but be worse served. So a kind of explicitly almost anti-meritocratic argument there in the sense we talked about before, saying that actually paying more will decrease the quality of the House of Commons rather than increase it. And this is a very common argument in the first half of the 20th century. However, again, we see this begin to shift over time, but in this case, actually a little slower. So although in the 1940s, we already have these arguments about professional ideal, even in the 1960s, we still see a good number of MPs rejecting this idea that they should be compared to other professions. This is a particularly interesting example because of this term which is used in the middle of this quote. An MP in the 1964 debate said, he strongly took the view that service in this house should not be a career, that if the salary reaches a level, the job becomes one people start too early in life, again, a trend which was well entrained by this point, we would produce a form of, as he says, oral civil servant, where a civil servant passes files and papers, a member of parliament passes words. So there's a sort of fear of professionalisation, a fear of being turned into another class of civil servant, still being expressed quite strongly in the 1960s. This, though, again, begins to change over time. And it begins to change over time, again, not just because of trends to do with politics, but because of broader social and economic trends, which Parliament is being dragged along with. So in this 1971 debate, for example, an MP links this question of the professionalisation of pay to this idea of the managerial revolution, the fact that in the rest of the economy, large firms are now no longer run by the people who own them, but are run by the professional managerial class who've risen up through corporations to run them. Again, an idea which is now sort of fairly common, but one which even in the 1970s was a relatively new idea. Another thing, as I said, that shaped this was the process of professionalising machinery of MPs' pay. So the top salaries review body, established in the 1970s, produces a series of reports which lean heavily into these two rhetorical trends among MPs that I've already talked about, both meritocracy and the comparison to other professions. These you'll often see referred to as the Boyle reports because of Charles Boyle, the first head of the top salaries review body. So this professionalizing rhetoric is also linked to the growing technocratic apparatus of the state, which is beginning to define the public sector, but also increasingly beginning to define politics and the way in which Parliament operates. Again, not without controversy. Just finally then, before I hand back to Richard and ask field questions on this, I also want to highlight though, on that last point, that this was not a series of trends that were without controversy, that these professionalizing and meritocratic rhetorics around politics were opposed largely from the left and right of the political spectrum, both of whom had distinctive arguments that opposed professionalization and suggested that this would lead to a decline in the quality of British politics. And so this quote, an interesting thing about these debates, which I wasn't expecting coming into them, was to find that the MP who spoke in more debates in the 20th century than any other MP, more debates on pay in the 20th century than any other MP, was in fact Enoch Powell. Now, Enoch Powell will be a name that's familiar to many of you. For anyone who isn't, Enoch Powell was an MP in the Conservative Party who is sort of most historically famous for a 1968 speech in which he opposed immigration to Britain and largely led to his exit from frontline politics. However, his ideological heritage is more important simply than that, these sort of anti-immigration rhetoric, similar to some sort of modern views. But he also was important in the kind of history of neoliberalism, the introduction of sort of free market ideas into the Conservative Party at the end of the post-war consensus, but also, as I found in this research, also important in opposing professionalizing rhetorics, which when we think about how these kind of three things come together in the ideology of a party like UKIP or the rhetoric of someone like Nigel Farage, becomes even more interesting. So the terms in which Powell opposed this professionalization of politics, again, was strikingly modern, even in the 1970s. So in this debate, for example, he said that, quote, "Our honour and the honour of this House is derived from the view that's held of our motives. And it's upon that, and only that our honour rests, on our own motivation. If we pay ourselves in this House a salary, such as a person of reasonable talents and education might aspire to, we shall be valued at the valuation we put on ourselves, as hacks, as people who have come into the job which offered us the best return for our limited talents and who wish to make a career of it." So that rhetoric of opposition to the political class, which again, we've seen so regularly over the last 10 years, maybe particularly since the expenses scandal, again, in the mouths of sort of modern populist politicians like Nigel Farage, was in some sense being developed in the 1970s in these debates by figures like Enoch Powell. There's also a left-wing equivalent, which maybe you can ask about in the questions if people are interested in, which I think mimics some of the anti-professional class, the professional political class rhetoric of, say, Jeremy Corbyn, and was developing roughly at the same time. So the situation today, just finally then, as I said, is that these debates are now a thing of the past. The Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority now determines MPs' pay entirely independent of any parliamentary process, which is really quite remarkable when we think about, as you say, as I've said in this lecture, that really these debates were used by MPs as a way to sort of shape and understand the way in which their roles emerge. And so although IPSA is in many ways a positive development, it's one which has managed to raise the level of MPs' pay to one which was probably too low to one which is now more adequate, as well as professionalising the way in which MPs' expenses works. It's also, and I think this is kind of crucial and part also of Enoch Powell's objections, it's removed the democratic channel through which MPs talked about pay. It's removed the need, in other words, to regularly stand up and answer questions like, What is an MP worth? What sort of person should be an MP? And what should the nature of the political class be? And I think in that sense, it demonstrates both the advantages of these kind of technocratic regulatory state solutions, but also some of the way in which they can hollow out democracy and lead to fewer opportunities to ask deep questions about the way in which our democracy works. So thank you all for listening to that. As I said, I would love to hear any questions and feedback you have on this work, and I'd be happy to go into more detail on any of the points that I mentioned here.